Hey, welcome to Leading with Gratitude Live. I'm your host, Chester Elton, the apostle of appreciation, coming to you from the gratitude epicenter of the universe, Summit, New Jersey. You know, our program is based on our Wall Street Journal bestselling book, Leading with Gratitude. You know, we say, give us 30 minutes. We'll give you, great information, great inspiration, and a roadmap to a personal life at work and at home of gratitude. Well, I want to introduce you my new friend. We've been trying to get this broadcast going for quite a while. He is the author of a wonderful book called The Future Leader. Jacob Morgan, welcome back to the program. We had a great fun talking for 10 minutes last night. What do you have to say to the our growing audience here today?
Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us again.
Yeah. You know, I love this topic of leadership, and I love your take on the future leader. You know, it's not just leadership now, it's what you've got to do to be a great leader in the future. So yeah. What really inspired you to write the book, The Future Leader?
Well, because I would get a lot of questions from leaders, so let me take it back. So before the pandemic, one of the things that I would do, and one of the things that I'm sure you would do as a speaker, is you travel around the world, you give a lot of talks at conferences and events. And one of the common questions that I would get from business leaders when I would give talks is, okay, yeah, we get kind of what's going on now, but where are things going in the future? What should we be doing? What should we be thinking about now? What should we be teaching our people now so that we can be ready to lead in whatever this new world of work is going to look like? And I certainly had some ideas on that, but I couldn't find any real research that specifically outlined how is leadership changing? Is it changing? And if so, what is leadership going to look like? And so I decided to embark on a research project to explore that. And that's pretty much what the book is based on.
Now, you interviewed lots of different people for this book. I mean, I love your research bent. Were there certain interviews that really gave you that aha as to what really needs to happen to create an excellent future leader?
Every CEO interview that I had was great. I mean, I learned something different from all of them. When I met with Mark Hurd, who unfortunately passed away, the former CEO of Oracle, we met in person, and just, that was a wonderful conversation. When I spoke with Hubert Joly, the former CEO of Best Buy, so many amazing business leaders had the opportunity to speak with. Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever. I think I learned something from each one of those business leaders, but perhaps the most interesting thing is that they all think about leadership differently. Mm-hmm. And it really taught me that leadership is a very subjective thing. There's no clear-cut definition of leadership that all the most successful CEOs share. It is different depending on the CEO that you talk to.
Was there anything that they all had in common? Like, were they all sort of people focused? Were they all, we love to say that the great leaders all have this thread of gratitude. What did you see that they all had in common, even though they expressed it and led differently?
Well, it's interesting. They were not all people focused. Some of the CEOs I interviewed, I said, how would you define leader and leadership? Which, by the way, separate note, that was the hardest question for CEOs to answer, because what I found is that a lot of us, we assume that we know what good and bad leadership looks like. And so as a result, we don't spend enough time trying to define it or explain it. Meaning it's kind of like trying to explain or define water. We all know what water is, and so we never take a step back to explain it. So the question that I asked all these CEOs is, if I came from another planet and I had no concept of leader or leadership, how would you explain it to somebody who's not familiar with it? And that really, really stumped all of the CEOs who I spoke with. And they were all kind of like, that's a good question. Like, nobody's ever asked me that before. But the responses I got were across the board. I got somebody, for example, like Hans Vestberg, the CEO of Verizon Communications, and he said leadership is really just all about ensuring the success of the business, and pretty much everything else is footnotes. Right. So he was he was a little bit more skewed towards, I would say, the results, the ROI, the financial stuff. And then you would get somebody else like a Hubert Joly, like a Paul Pullman, who didn't really talk about the financial performance of the business. Yet the interesting thing is Hans Vestberg has been a very, very successful CEO. Hubert Joly has been a very, very successful CEO, but they both approach leadership differently. So the important thing is the way that you define leadership as a CEO, as a business leader, it not only influences the culture of the company, but also the success of the business. If you focus on dollars and cents, that's going to be the type of culture that you create. Those are the types of leaders who will get promoted. If you focus on being on gratitude, on being a purpose-driven leader, then those are the types of leaders who will get promoted. So it's kind of like the way that you define it dictates the filters in your company.
Isn't that fascinating? We have this wonderful international audience. We got Priya from India. We've got folks from Cameroon. We've got Ayush, I hope I said that right, from India as well. We've got folks coming in from Nigeria, John from Lagos, Nigeria. Did you find as you interviewed leaders that they had to lead differently in different parts of the world? Did you delve into that at all?
Not so much as far as leading differently in different parts of the world, but I did speak with a lot of business leaders, not just in the United States, but also in parts of the world like Turkey, like Japan, like Australia. And so there were a lot of very, very common threads and themes that came up from these CEO interviews. And that's pretty much what the book is about. What are the common skills and mindsets that these CEOs identified as being most crucial for leaders?
So you do divide it up into skills and mindsets. And I love the titles of your book. You're clearly a sci-fi guy, which is wonderful. You talk about the 5 mindsets. You've got the explorer, the chef, the servant, the global citizen. And then the skills, you've got the futurist, the Yoda, which I love.
Yes.
The translator, the coach, and the tech teenager. Let's go to the 4 mindsets. Do you need to have all 4 to be a great leader, or can you really be excellent in just one?
Well, you could, of course, certainly be excellent in just one. You can pick one and excel at that, but then I don't think that's going to make you a great leader. So, for example, let's say you pick the mindset of the chef, which is all about balancing humanity and technology inside of your organization. You might be the best chef, so to speak, that there is. You have a very good sense of balancing humanity and technology, but you lack in the areas of recognizing your people. You lack in the areas of being, having the servant mindset. You don't have humility and vulnerability. You don't take care of yourself. You might lack in the explorer mindset, where you don't practice having a growth mindset. You're not agile and nimble. Or the global citizen mindset, meaning you're not able to think big picture and you're not comfortable surrounding yourself with people who are not like you. So you can see that even if you're great at the humanity and the technology aspect, if you struggle in the other areas, you're going to have a hard time as a leader. So the point of the book is that you do need all 4 mindsets. And look, let's be honest. When we're talking about the grand scheme of things, 4 mindsets and 5 skills is not a lot. Okay. If I told you that there were 9 things, 4 mindsets and 5 skills that you needed to do in order to become a great leader, to unlock your potential, unlock the potential of your people, make your organization more successful. If you're not willing to do those 9 things, you probably shouldn't be in a leadership position.
Yeah, it is interesting. We'd love to get your questions, by the way. Put them in the chat box. I'm sure you've got a lot of questions about your definition of leadership, how it might apply to your country. We've got folks from the UK and Colombia and Namibia, by the way, which is a first-time caller, which is great. You have a lot of great stories here. But before we get to that, we've talked about the mindsets, the skills. Again, the 5 skills, the futurist, the Yoda, the translator, the coach, and the tech teenager. Expound on those a little bit and why those are so crucial. And I want you to delve into Yoda in particular, and of course the tech teenager. You have such creative titles for your chapters.
You're making me pull open the book to make sure I don't forget any of them.
Yoda, a great leader he was. Yes.
I actually have a funny story about the Yoda one, which we'll get to. Okay, so the 5 skills. So interestingly enough, the most important skill that these CEOs identified as being most crucial for leaders is the skill of the futurist, which is in terms of thinking in terms of possibilities and scenarios, not just in terms of picking one path and going down it. I draw the analogy with chess. What separates a great chess player from a somewhat novice chess player is a novice chess player will see one move on the board. That's the only move I can make. That's the only move my opponent will reply with. But the reality is that top grandmasters, they think in terms of multiple scenarios, multiple options. That was the number 1 skill that these CEOs identified as being most crucial. Another skill that we have is the skill of the coach. The skill of the coach is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It is unlocking the potential of your people. And so, for example, if you've ever watched any kind of sporting event, basketball, tennis, hockey, whatever it is, whenever the team wins, whenever the athlete wins, they typically say we couldn't have done it without our coach. And it doesn't mean that the coach is the best player, but what the coach does is they help you become a better version of yourself. They help you do things that you didn't know that you could do. But the difference is that a lot of leaders, they think that their job as a coach, as a leader, is to just help make other people more successful. And that is kind of getting you some of the way there, but it's not the full story. So I want to challenge everybody watching and listening that I want you to add 2 words to the end of that. Help make everyone more successful than you. If you add those 2 words to the end of that, that's where the time, the attention, the focus, the dedication comes into play. Because you can spend 5 minutes with somebody and you know what? They're a little bit more successful, just a tiny bit more successful. And you could say, look, I'm a great leader. They're a little bit more successful. That's not the case, right? We want to get people to be even more successful than you. So that's what the skill of the coach is all about.
Now, let me jump in there for just a second, because in order to do that, doesn't there need to be a certain amount of humility on the leader's part? Often we when we say we work for bad leaders, is they always wanted to be the smartest person in the room, and your idea was never quite as good as his or hers. So talk a little bit about that, because I love that concept. I want to make you better than me. And yet I think that's hard for a lot of leaders, isn't it?
It is. That's why if you go back to the mindsets, part of the mindset of the servant is humility and vulnerability. And so this is why these things play together, because if you don't have the mindsets are how you think, and the skills are things that you do. The skills are the manifestations of the mindsets. So if you don't have the mindsets, it's going to be very hard for you to practice the skills. So for example, if you don't believe that people should come before profits, if you don't believe that you should help make other people more successful than you, then how are you going to practice it? And more importantly, if you try to practice it and it's not authentic, right? I mean, if for example, we were at the same company and I was like, you know what, and I was your boss, and I had this mentality of like, you know what, I'm Chester's boss. Darn it, that guy needs to do everything that I tell him to do, command and control. He shouldn't be asking me any questions. Meanwhile, I try to help you become more successful. You can see that my brain is not going to be able to process, how do I help Chester become more successful, but I want to protect myself. I believe that Chester should just be doing what I tell him to do. So the skills and the mindsets match up.
Excellent. Okay, so deep dive on Yoda.
Yes. And as I mentioned, I have a funny story about Yoda, which I can share. So Yoda is all about emotional intelligence. And this is specifically empathy and self-awareness. Empathy is about putting yourself into somebody else's shoes, seeing things from their perspective. And self-awareness is about, do you know your own strengths, your own weaknesses, and just as importantly, do other people around you know your strengths and your weaknesses? Because it's one thing when you identify yourself as a certain way, but do other people see you the same way? So for example, if one of your skills, your perceived skills is around communication, you might think, you know what, I'm the best darn communicator that's out there. Well, if everybody around you says, hey, you know what, Jacob is a terrible communicator, there's clearly a misalignment between my self-awareness, my internal and my external self-awareness. So that's what that piece is. And the kind of funny story about Yoda is that I was giving a talk to a large pharma company, and this was, I think it was earlier this year actually. And I was giving my talk about Yoda, and after my talk, one of the top executives came up to me in a very, very serious tone, and he's like, Jacob, I love the concept of Yoda, but have you thought about renaming it to Baby Yoda? And I was like, this guy's trolling me, right? Like, yeah. He can't be serious. And he's like, have you seen The Mandalorian? Because the Baby Yoda is also very emotionally intelligent. And I'm like, all right, where are the cameras? This guy's punking me. Like, something weird's going on here. And so I had to have a very serious conversation with this top executive at this big global company about Yoda and Baby Yoda. And in all honesty, I have not seen The Mandalorian yet, but it is on my to-do list.
You know what? I hear it's fabulous. In fact, it was the one thing that was almost caused me to buy Disney Plus was to get The Mandalorian. You're getting great feedback here, Jacob. Wow, awesome, incredible, excellent. Wow, great. So you're resonating with a lot of the viewers. I love this comment from Gary Rich, actually, a good friend of ours from WD-40. He says, make sure empathy eats your ego. What's your reaction to that?
No, it's great. I mean, Gary was one of the CEOs who I interviewed. So hello, Gary. WD-40, wonderful, wonderful company. And he gave me this great story, and I think I actually used it in the book as well. He calls it the soul-sucking CEO, which I love.
I've got my doll here somewhere, Gary. I'm sorry I don't have it handy.
Yeah. So, I mean, he's of course correct, and perhaps more importantly, Gary is Australian, and I was born in Australia, so I'm never going to disagree with anything that Gary says. But it's true. I mean, if you have a very big ego and you believe that as the CEO or as a leader, you're better than everyone, you're smarter than everyone, you're more attractive than everyone, you're going to have a very hard time practicing any form of empathy inside of your company. And so Gary's 100% right. Of course, he's the leader of a company, so he knows this firsthand. But you can't, I mean, as a leader going forward, if you have a big ego, you're going to have a very, very hard time. Now, Gary also brings up a very, very interesting point, because traditionally in the realm of leadership, it was the leaders with the biggest egos who typically made it farther in the company. If you think about how most leaders got into their positions, they have the bigger egos. They have been at the company longer. They bring in the most amount of money. They're better at office politics and bureaucracy, right? They have a friend in a leadership position who helped bump them up. And this is why when I interviewed these 140 CEOs, I said, is leadership going to change? And the collective response was yes, because in order to be a leader, you're not going to be able to get by doing those things. You're genuinely going to have to earn your leadership. You're not going to be able to just be given a leadership title.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? And you would often hear, and this was years ago and probably still today, she's got a big ego, or he's got a big, and that's a good thing. Yeah. And you kind of go, maybe not, maybe not. That servant leadership has become so much more important. Talk to me about what you're talking to leaders about today. Clearly, when you wrote the book, the pandemic wasn't in full bloom, right? So knowing what you know about your mindsets and skills and so on, is there a particular area where CEOs really need your help now in becoming the best leader of the future they can be?
The interesting thing is that, so the book is called The Future Leader. And so I think one of the most crucial aspects here is that the timeline for becoming the future leader has shrunk. In other words, this isn't just about becoming the future leader. This is about being the present leader. And so the timeline that I looked at, my goal was, let's look out 10 years. What is a leader going to look like in the year 2030? And so the book was a map on how do you, of course, become a successful leader now, but stay a successful leader through the next decade by practicing these skills and mindsets. But what we've seen in the world of business now, with things like COVID, with Black Lives Matter, with the social and racial injustice that's out there, is that these are crucial things to practice now. And the interesting thing is, I actually had a couple of people on my podcast, top business leaders at big global companies, chief human resource officers, that kind of level. Two of who have since been fired or let go from their organizations because they were not able to practice these skills and mindsets effectively. And I won't name names necessarily, although I did write a LinkedIn post about it. But one was the CHRO of 24 Hour Fitness, and the other one was the CHRO of Adidas. So Beth Tasca and Karen Parkin, right? I mean, and at the time when I interviewed them 5 years ago, they were very globally respected, top CHROs in the space, and they received a lot of backlash through some actions, through some responses that they did internally and externally, and they're no longer with the company anymore. So this just goes to show that as a leader, you need to adapt. Otherwise, it's not just your peers who are going to force you out. It's going to be your employees who force you. They will rise up against you and say, this should not be a leader. This person should not be a leader in the company. So the crucial thing here is, don't just practice this for your company. These are crucial things to practice in terms of self-preservation. And so the biggest question that I get from a lot of these business leaders is kind of what we've been talking about, is they say, look, we get the world is changing. We understand that we are living in a new world. Work is changing. Just everything is changing. How do we lead effectively? How do we deal with these changes? How do we keep employees engaged? How do we get our leaders to challenge the conventional mindsets and approaches that they've always had around leadership? And so this is the mentality that a lot of business leaders and organizations, why they bring me in is, to help get them to make that switch of leadership is changing. It's not what it used to be. And here's what you need to do.
I love we popped up on the screen, the futureorganization.com. Is that's the best website for people to get information, learn more about your work?
So that's my personal website. But if people, for example, want to get a PDF that just outlines these skills and mindsets, along with a quote from some of the CEOs that I interviewed, for that, you can go to theleadershipdigest.com, theleadershipdigest.com. And we also put an assessment. Am I allowed to mention the assessment too?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So if you want to see how well you're practicing these skills and mindsets, you can go to futureleadersurvey.com. And then maybe one last thing I'll mention is we just put out the course, a course that is based on this book. And if people are interested in that, you can go to futureleadercourse.com.
Okay, well, we've got Christy Lawrence, who's the ghost of the machine, and she's typing away madly so we can pop it up on the screen from her back porch in Atlanta, Georgia. We'll give Christy a shout out at the end of the show. Great resources, and I love that you share so much of that. One of the things we love to do on the show is obviously introduce our viewers and listeners to really interesting people and interesting concepts. More important than that is the tools to actually get it done. So these assessments, clearly your book, which I know is available on Amazon. And by the way, anybody can buy just one book, right? Buy one for yourself and one for a friend. There's nothing wrong with that.
This is why I love you, Chester.
Hey, you've got some great stories in the book. And one in particular, you talk about the CEO of Taylor Morrison, yes, Cheryl Palmer, and the two letters, which I just think is so ridiculously heartwarming. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to tell that story again.
So Cheryl Palmer, and I'm actually scrolling through the book to see if I can find the full quote from her. But Cheryl Palmer is the CEO of a company called Taylor Morrison. And here's the quote, which I can read as well. And so Taylor Morrison is a home building company. And when I interviewed a lot of these CEOs, I would ask them, what one moment most shaped your approach to leadership or who you are as a leader? Was there a specific moment in your life that caused you to approach leadership in a certain way? And Cheryl gave me one of my favorite answers, and it was a personal story of hers. And the story she said, it was kind of like a tale of two letters, so to speak. And what happened is the hardest choice that Cheryl ever had to make was to write two letters to her team. One letter was basically, I'll see you in 6 weeks. And the second letter that she had to write to her team was carry on the legacy that we started. Wow. And so it turned out that Cheryl had a brain tumor and she was going in for surgery, and she didn't know if she was going to make it out of that surgery okay or not. And so before she went into the surgery, she had to pen two letters to her team, to her family, to everybody. And the two versions of the letter were, one was if the surgery went well and she would be back at the office in 6 weeks, that's the letter that she wanted her team to receive. And if the surgery didn't go well, which we all know what that means, then there was a second letter that she wanted her team to receive. And this was about carrying on the legacy, carrying on the torch, all the great work that they've done. And she said that when she wrote those two letters, that really clicked something in her mind. And I have the quote here. Do you want me to read the quote?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm going to read the quote from Cheryl. And she says, and apologies to everybody for not memorizing this paragraph. She said, although I always believed I lived life to the fullest and looked for the good in each person and situation, going through this, and this being that brain surgery and the two letters, made me realize how precious each life encounter really is. And it made me a better leader because I was able to appreciate how important every interaction is and not to take anything or anyone for granted. Many leaders go through their days fighting fires and not appreciating the golden rule of business. People work for people and not companies. A leader's responsibility is to set the vision and not allow the business to just happen, but rather make relationships and interactions intentional, meaningful, and purposeful. Some may consider it really hard work, but being a leader is a choice. And if you decide that this is who you really are, there is no middle ground. It's all consuming, not two parallel paths. And being a leader can't just be when you show up to the office. It's your natural passion and an eerie intersection in all parts of our lives. But when you really do it, it's the most rewarding life journey in the world. And every time I read that quote and share that story, I always get goosebumps when I share it.
Oh, yeah.
And it was the really touching thing was there was going to be a part of the business that was going to be sold in the UK. And literally the day before her brain surgery, the night before her brain surgery, she's negotiating a deal, making sure that if a sale happens, that her people are going to be taken care of. Like, that's how she spent the last few hours before her brain surgery, is knowing that even if she doesn't make it out of the surgery, she's taking care of her people. And that, to me, is truly amazing, because we hear a lot about this concept of putting people first. And to me, putting people first is a combination of two things. It's the philosophy backed by a set of actions. Having the philosophy is not hard. A lot of organizations say they have the philosophy of putting people first, yet they let go of 5,000 employees and 10,000 employees.
Right.
So they have the philosophy, but it's not backed up by the actions. And I always tell this story of this waffle shop that's a couple miles away from where I live. And it's called Oli's Waffle Shop, and they own a business next door called Wine and Waffles. And it's a husband and wife entrepreneurial team. And they were about to retire before this pandemic started. And they bought a beautiful plot of land. They were going to build their dream home. And then the pandemic hit. Now, I should point out that when you go into Oli's Waffle Shop, they have pictures of all of the employees who work there who helped build the business, 40 employees. And so this pandemic hit, and a lot of their employees really started to struggle. They couldn't pay for their rent. They couldn't pay for basic expenses. So this husband and wife entrepreneurial couple, they got rid of that land where they were going to build their dream home. And they put the $400,000 back into the business to help pay the wages of their people. And when asked why they did this, they just said, how could we not do this? We're not the types of people to just let our employees, struggle and suffer. And so that's the philosophy backed by the set of actions. And I hear that. And then you hear stories of these big companies who are letting go of 5,000 employees or 10,000 employees. And it makes me wonder, like, this waffle shop is able to figure it out. And you, with your multi-billion-dollar valuation, you're telling me that you can't figure it out? It's kind of like, so that's what I mean when I say leading by putting people first. Philosophy, but you need the actions behind it.
Yeah. And I love when they're true to their promise, right?
Yes.
Really interesting. Ryan Allen says in the comment section, he says the problem is people don't respect leaders anymore. And I think it's because their actions don't match up. Well, Susan Smith, a great question on the screen right now. Do you believe empathy can be learned by leaders?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I think any of these things can be learned by leaders. Part of the challenges with empathy, especially from a leadership perspective, is they can't practice what they don't see. So, if a leader is isolated in their ivory tower in their beautiful corner office and they don't see the other aspects of the business, it's very hard for them to practice empathy. But, there are several organizations, I think even Amazon does this. They have their leaders spend time in the call center, talking to customers, right? So they can see and experience firsthand what it's like to be a customer and what it's like to work with these customers. So if you want your leaders to practice empathy, put them in those actual positions. Have them experience what everybody else is experiencing. Don't just necessarily tell them about it, but have them go through it. Take a leader out of their comfort zone. Get rid of your beautiful corner office and your parking spot that's right next to the building. Park where everybody else is half a mile away and walk to the office every day and see how you feel after that.
Yeah, walk in their shoes, right? Walk in their shoes.
Have them go through all this.
Time always flies because you're always so engaging. We got like 2 minutes left. I do like this question, though. What is the difference between a mentor and a coach? Is it long-term sustainable development as the mentor and the coach is more immediate? What would you say to our LinkedIn user?
Yeah, it's kind of tough. Sometimes it comes down to semantics because I know some people define coach and mentor the same way. Some people talk about it differently. So it's kind of hard to say specifically what the difference is. I mean, ultimately, I think, a coach might, and this is how I've heard some people explain it. Sometimes people view a coach as somebody who's a little bit more engaged and active and participatory, whereas a mentor is kind of like the guide who's not as involved with the weeds per se, but they kind of sit back and they're there whenever you want to come to them for advice or feedback. But again, that's not necessarily true for everybody. I think a good coach is a good mentor, and a good mentor is also a good coach. So they both kind of go together. Yeah. But as far as is one long term versus one short term, I think that's just kind of semantics.
Well, it's really interesting. Now, of course, at the end of the show, we're getting all these great questions. So we'll go in and we'll answer them. Do you think African leaders can learn empathy? And and so on. How do you get people to change their priorities? Well, by the way, the roadmap to all of this is in Jacob's brilliant book, The Future Leader: 9 Skills and Mindsets to Succeed in the Next Decade. Highly recommend it. It's published by Wiley, available on Amazon. We've got all kinds of websites that we've mentioned to you. Please go there. We always like to ask the question from our book is, where did you find your gratitude today? Hashtag find your gratitude. So Jacob, today, and it's a little earlier where you are than where I am, but where did you find your gratitude today?
So this morning, so we have a soon to be 3-month-old.
Congratulations.
And I actually filmed him doing this. So he was sleeping and I woke up, and my wife was already downstairs at 5 a.m. So he's sleeping in his little bassinet next to us. And I walked over there, and there's the moment where like a little baby is first starting to wake up and their kind of eyeballs are opening up. And I did a little video of him, and the first thing he did when he was opening his eyes, he just let out this big smile. Before he even fully opened up his eyes. And I was like, man, that's the way to start the day. He didn't even open his eyes yet. And while he's still half asleep, he's already got the smile on his face. And that made me smile, and that gave me my gratitude for the day.
Isn't that great? I got to share a great story with my dad, who was my best friend. I had a similar story. I said, Dad, Cassie's our first baby. Of course, I'm youngest of 5. Cassie was like the 25th grandchild or whatever. He goes, yeah, that's sweet. It was probably just gas. At any rate, hey, listen, it's been a delight. Make sure you pick up your copy of The Future Leader. Highly recommended. Great ideas.
There we go.
Leading with gratitude. We're grateful for your time coming to spend with us. Follow us on LinkedIn. We've got a wonderful newsletter, the Gratitude Journal on LinkedIn. Please share it with friends. We're going to go in and answer all of your other questions. It's been great to be with you. We say, look, lead with gratitude. It's not just a great way to lead your organization. It's a great way to lead your life. I hope you'll be a little more grateful, a little more kind, and a little more patient. And that's our story, and we're sticking to it. Wave to the crowd, Jacob. It's wonderful to have you with you. You guys have a gratitude-filled day and become the future leader that your people need. Take care, everybody. Cheers. It's